Hello and welcome to episode 33 of the world's first Paul Weller fan podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and 10 years ago I gave up my live streaming career as a radio presenter with one big regret: never getting to interview my hero, the legendary British musician Paul Weller. This podcast exists purely to solve that issue. Welcome to Desperately Seeking Paul. And this week we head back to the start of Paul's solo career. In 1989, Paul Weller found himself without a band and recording deal for the first time since he was 18. After taking time off for most of 1990, he returned to the road at the tail end of that year, touring as the Paul Weller Movement. The comeback is on, and my guest was part of it, bass player Paul Francis, part of the Paul Weller Movement ahead of that very first solo album. We'll hear all about those early days after the end of the Style Council, life on the road with Paul Weller, Steve White, and bizarrely Max Beesley, which we'll get into as well. Yes, the Hollywood actor. So let's dive straight in. Paul Francis, thanks for joining me.
You're welcome, sir. You're welcome.
We're going to get into so much interesting stuff about, I guess, what I'm going to call the return of Paul Weller and the Paul Weller movement and your role in that as well, and a really exciting time. But before we get to that, I want to kick off with when you first discovered the music of Paul Weller, because I understand you were a bit of a punk. Would that be right?
I was into the punk movement, yeah, but I wasn't really a punk because I had really long hair. Well, I had an afro, actually, Dan.
That's allowed in the punk world, isn't it? I mean, I've got a bit of an afro going on at the moment as well, to be fair.
I don't know. I just like music. I love punk music. I loved it. I was into the Pistols and the Clash, but I was also into other things, like funk and reggae. So right across the board, Dan, really. Because I was living in Camden, it was a hub of music in the 70s and like late 70s, early 80s. I used to see these jam sort of posters up and about, and who's this? Who's this band sort of thing? And to be honest, it wasn't really until the Style Council that I really did sort of begin to sort of understand what that, about Paul and stuff. So, but I remember seeing all the jam posters up and around town thinking, this looks interesting,
And what was it about the Style Council? And we're going to touch on your friendship and work with Steve White, the drummer from the Style Council, and from Mick Talbot, who's come up a lot on this podcast as being an amazing fun guy, super talented guy. But what was it about the Style Council, do you think, that really stood out?
If you compare the two, they are kind of worlds apart, really, musically, aren't they? The Jam and the Style Council. For the 80s, there was that kind of soul element that started to get introduced into a lot of people's music. But I think about when Paul wrote songs, they were a bit deeper, sort of lyrically. Even though the music may have been sort of slightly softer than the Jam, I think lyrically his music was like ahead of a lot of the other sort of bands around at the time. And that's what I really liked about that sort of juxtaposition between the music and the hard edge of the lyrics, really. That's what I liked about it.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly packed a punch. And you mentioned kind of living in Camden. At that time, you're talking about amazing live venues, but also some great clubs. I mean, that must have been really a really exciting time to be in and amongst that place in London.
It was amazing. Well, and the thing is, I always refer to the venues as they were originally, like the Jazz Cafe. The Jazz Cafe to me is Barclays Bank, because that's what it was.
Oh, was it? Really?
Yeah. So people say, do you fancy going down to the Jazz Cafe? I say, I believe you mean Barclays Bank, sure.
I didn't know that. That's brilliant. All I'm thinking about now is that must be why the soundproofing was so good at the Jazz Cafe, because it's a bank. It's those steel walls. I mean, I've seen like unused sound in there and like Adrian Sherwood and stuff. And you're like, how is this not bleeding outside? This is so loud, and it's because it was a bank. That answers every question.
The TNC was, I can't remember, it's been called loads of different things, but that was called something else. But because I was there for 40 years, obviously, before I moved out, but I watched it all change. But I was there for the opening week of Dingwalls because I bunked in. I climbed in the bog windows at the back, and that was really good.
Dingwalls was amazingly influential as a venue and a scene, really, as much as anything else, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And also, I've noticed looking back that there was varied musical acts on from night to night, which is great if you're growing up and learning, trying to get involved in music. And it wasn't any particular style. And that's what I really liked about Dingwalls. You could go one night and see a blues, you could see punk, you could see anything down there. It was great. I must tell you this, I did pay to get in eventually.
I take your word for it. And at which point do you decide, you know what, I'm soaking all this up, but I want to work in music? At which point did you go, I'm going to pick up an instrument, I'm going to learn how to play?
Well, I think it was probably about 79 when because I did my first sort of professional gig and tour in 79. And I wasn't quite sure if I would be able or capable to do it, but it was the people around me that kind of said, come on, man, you're good enough, you can do it. And it was other people believing in me more than I believed in myself at the time, and it kind of got me kick-started, really.
And was it always the bass?
Well, actually, I started playing guitar when I was about 16, but it was too hard.
Oh. So what did you do? What two are too many strings?
Yeah, so I cut two off, and it was easy. Well, I did know, seriously, I did, yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It's not that simple, surely. I suppose it is. I haven't really thought about this. Yeah, I suppose it is.
Right, you're right. And no instrument's easier, which I learned to my detriment later on in life. But, when you're 16 or 17, it's like a mathematical equation. 4 is less than 6. Right?
Yeah. That's brilliant. We're going to take a journey into Paul's comeback as a solo artist in a sec, and you being part of that Paul Weller movement. But to get there, we have to start with Whitey. So Steve White, the Style Council, and you with the James Taylor Quartet. So tell me about this. How does this work?
Right. Well, basically, we had a mutual friend, a drummer called Harbans, who had I think he was with Animal Nightlife at the time, and he was a friend of Steve's and a friend of mine. And Harbans and I used to play quite a lot together. And he mentioned that James Taylor was looking for a guy to do the Starsky and Hutch sessions. So he sort of got in touch with Steve, and then, it didn't happen because I had to go to America to do another album, but that was the general initial connection between Steve and I. And
then you move into Galliano, which, for those that don't know, it was the first signing, the first band on Acid Jazz Records, which was Eddie Piller and Gilles Peterson's record label.
Yeah.
They then did a bunch of stuff on Talking Loud, which was the record label that Gilles set up after that, and had these huge big top 40 albums, A Plot Thickens, A Joyful Noise, Unto the Creator. So how did you get involved in Galliano? Because I gather at the start it was kind of you, Mick Talbot, Steve, obviously the Style Council guys, Roberto Galliano or Rob Gallagher. I'm not sure which one to go with. What did you call him?
Rob.
Okay.
I always thought calling him Galliano was a bit rude. If you came up to me and said, "Oi, Francis, come here," I'd feel annoyed. Because Steve and I were doing JTQ and we got on quite well musically, and then he was really trying to get stuff happening. So he hooked up with Rob, and obviously Mick was around, so Mick was on board with that, and then he gave me a ring, so we had this little trio going on. We started to do that, but it was the same time as Paul, so we had to sort of juggle things around, really. It was a bit tricky because the week we started rehearsing with Paul, we also had this TV with Rob, and we had to cancel the first couple of days of rehearsal for Paul, and I was a bit embarrassed by that, to be honest. I mean, I could have he wouldn't have fired Steve or Mick, but he could have fired me.
And now, the Paul Weller story wouldn't be the Paul Weller story without touching on Steve White, because I think his drumming throughout the Style Council, through the solo years, it became such an important part of that sound. I know he's a friend, so this might be a little embarrassing if he's listening, but please tell us, what is it that makes Steve White so great? Why is he such a great drummer?
On a personal level, he's hilarious. He's one of the funniest guys I've ever met. He's funny and he's really smart as well, right? On a personal level. Technically, he's an amazing player. I mean, for those who watched him within the Style Council and outside, all the other things he's done, the jazz thing he's done, the pop thing he's done, they'll know technically he's an amazing player. And when you put all those things together, his personality and his playing, what you get is Steve, really.
This is the point where the Style Council's final album has been rejected. So Modernism, Polydor say no. Paul takes a little bit of a break. I actually thought it was a longer break, but actually I hadn't realised 1990 is back performing live. When you read articles in the past now, it makes it sound like he's kind of been looking after his kids for 5 years or something, but it seems like it's just 6 months. He makes out he's like a house husband for ages. How do you hear that Paul wants to get back into playing, and how does the movement come about?
With gigs like this, because they are pretty big gigs, it's all slightly hush-hush, and it's like you get a phone call and listen, are you free on a certain day? And you say, yeah. And you say, why? So I can't tell you. Bong. You're like, okay, fair enough. So, I knew there was something on the boil, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. And I completely understand why you don't want to give too much information away on an artist like that. So eventually I get the call, I've got to get down to Solid Bond, which I think was Paul's studio, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I went down there, I took the bass, and it was Steve that got me that connection. He said, look, just come down and have a play. And he didn't say anything about a band or a tour. He said, just come have a play and see see what happens. So I went in the room and, Paul was there. I panicked inwardly I panicked, sat down and, so we just started playing. But Paul started playing The Ghetto by Donny Hathaway. And there's a really fat groove on that tune. And I kind of knew it really well. So I just kind of sat in there and started playing. And it all sort of gelled together. And from that moment, I think was the beginning of my involvement with Paul, really.
And what's the time gap between that? I'm not going to call that an audition. That just sounds like an audition makes it sound like a job interview, whereas that just sounds like a blast playing with some mates. But what's the time gap between that audition, in inverted commas, and getting back on the road?
I don't think it was that long. I mean, it was not 90, so it's a little while ago. It didn't appear to me to be that long. Before I knew it, he booked us into Nomis, which is a amazing, I don't know if it's still there or not, rehearsal room owned by Simon Napier Bell in West London. And we were in Studio 2, which is one of the bigger studios upstairs. And I remember us being there for 2 weeks, but I don't remember the time frame between me meeting Paul and with that first audition. That's I can't remember, Dan. I'm sorry.
The purpose of those 2 weeks are what? To kind of work out what the set list is, obviously rehearsals, but as much, I suppose, those very early gigs, and we'll touch on the Dingwalls one in a second, which launched it all. But
that's right. Yeah.
So much of it is him digging back into the jam, back into the Style Council. There's not a huge amount of new material, so presumably there's a lot of discussion about which of the older songs should he play.
There was that, and I don't think we were. Well, the rhythm section wasn't necessarily part of that equation about what the material was going to be. But obviously with the brass section, they needed to know for their arrangements. They were more hooked into what was being, what the tunes were going to be. But I can remember we played quite a few tunes, did we not? Like Into Tomorrow and Cosmos, wasn't that not? Were you at Dingwalls then? Did you go to Dingwalls?
I didn't go to Dingwalls. I've seen this. Actually, I've got the set list here. Let's go through it. So this is the November the 1st, 1990. So over 30 years ago. So to be fair, all of our memories are going to be pretty jaded from that length of time, if only for what we've all been through for the past year, to be fair. But this is Dingwalls, the first gig, the first solo gig, but it's called the Paul Weller Movement. Kicks off with Cosmos. What a banging tune. So this is a new song, a new one to the repertoire. Then we've got My Ever Changing Moods, Homebreakers, the Style Council, Round and Round, which is again another new tune, Strange Museum, which was I know written with Mick Talbot, but off the first solo album. Just Like Yesterday, that Spiritual Feeling. These are all songs. I mean, Spiritual Feeling's an instrumental. Here's a new thing, Precious, which is a jam song, Work to Do, which I think's an Isley Brothers song, if I remember.
Brothers,
and The Loved, which was a B-side later on. So it's it's not a massively familiar set list, but there's enough there for people to go, oh yeah, I know this one is a new one, I know this one. But it's a different sound, and I think it's a really funky sound. And I think if you look back on those videos and stuff, the dynamics of the band is very different to the Style Council. It's very different to his final work with the Style Council, this kind of house album. How would you define that sound as being part of that mix?
Well, I think that because of the acid jazz thing, that fusion of those two types of music, that opened up as well. So blues started to be part of that, and soul and funk started to be part of the organic ground that you could sort of grab ideas from, and even rock, like Rare Earth. Is it Rare Earth? Who's that band on acid jazz?
Mother Earth.
Mother Earth, that was it. Yeah, that was kind of, they sort of, all these bands, and the whole scene started to open up a bit and allowing a lot of influences to come in. That's only my personal opinion, but I think that's possibly why it was so varied in terms of the musical, the genres in that set, really. The
other thing about that time is it all looks so, you guys all look so sharp, man.
Oh, yes. Because of Nicky, wasn't there?
Oh, yeah. So Nicky Weller, who has been on the podcast recently, was what, your stylist or the wardrobe or what?
Yes. Well, she was like a sort of stylist stroke head mistress. She used to keep us in line, Get that shirt on. No, you look crap in that. Put that. It was like, it was great. It was great.
Brilliant. John Weller's here this time as well, so he's still Paul's manager. He's sorting these gigs, and we'll talk about the travels across Europe that you go on this tour as well. But he was such a key part of the success of Paul's career all the way through.
Thing is, you knew John was coming before he arrived. Do you know what I mean? It was just like, here he comes. You could just feel him in the building. It was amazing, really. Great character, John. Actually. Lovely guy. Only dealings really were financial with him, really, and a few small conversations, but nothing bad to say about John, man.
Was he carrying around the briefcase full of cash still at this point?
Might have been.
You can't say for tax purposes, sorry. So that first gig is at Dingwalls. What can you remember about that first gig with the Movement live on stage? And how can you remember? Was it packed out? Was it a decent crowd?
Well, it was really busy, and I remember the stage. Well, it's a small stage, and I remember I remember looking around at Steve, and I was like, it's sort of cramped like this. And Max, the vibes player, stroke actor,
Max Beesley, who we would now know as a big Hollywood actor. Back then was playing keys? Is that right?
Oh, keys and vibes, yeah.
Keys and vibes.
I know. I can't believe it. Then when I see him on TV now, I'm sort of going, no,
I want to get Max on because I'd love to hear this story. But that's such an interesting lineup. So yeah, fill us back in Dingwalls. So you're looking across at each other in this tiny stage, yeah.
Well, yeah, and the whole thing, like tiny stage, but Paul, juxtaposed against each other. Wow, we're on stage with Paul in a tiny little club. But in a way, I think, a lot of bands started like that through the 60s and 70s anyway. A lot of the big bands started in small clubs, the Marquee. And the Dingwalls also had that sort of vibe to it. So it was really, really, the electric was flying around. It was an amazing feeling, really. And that band was quite big for Dingwalls, to be honest. I don't know how they got them on stage, but they did.
And what's the feeling at the time? Because obviously this is not Wembley Arena. This is not the Royal Albert Hall. This is not Glastonbury Festival. This is not what Paul had been used to with the Jam and the Style Council. It's much smaller. Did it feel like he had something to prove? Was it relaxed? Was it, actually he's angry, or he's just kind of chilled about the whole thing?
I think all three. It depends, because I'm fronting in my own band now, but I was always like a session guy, so I never really understood the pressure that was on the man at the front. And I think you can go through all those three things. You can go through ecstasy, you can go through anger, you can go through depression. If you're at the front, it's a really big job. And I think when I look back on that period now, I can see when, the quiet moments when Paul didn't seem to respond was he had a lot of stuff on his mind. I can totally see that now. But having said that, he always delivered. It doesn't matter where he was playing. He always delivered. It's a learning curve, when you're working with someone like that and you watch that amount of sort of professional, I call it professionalism really, but it's incredible to watch really.
So that first gig in London, and then you would expect to go on a UK tour, but the first thing you do is go to Europe. So you go to Turin, Milan, Hanover, Hamburg, Berlin, Amsterdam. I mean, that must have been incredible.
It was brilliant. It was great. It was great. I mean, although having said that, I've pretty much done that a few times in the past. The same sort of, you always end up going to the same countries. It's always like France, Germany, Italy, Holland. When you're going touring with these bands, you always end up going to the same places. But it was different with Paul. It was a slightly step up. Do you know what I mean? So it was a step up in terms of the reception you got in both the gigs and the hotels and everywhere else. And it was. I'll never forget it, to be honest, really.
And I imagine it's the first time a lot of these songs have been played live, but also the Style Council towards the end didn't tour a huge amount. So it's the first time he's back in some of those venues and those countries for the first time for a while. And you are back playing universities and polytechnics. So like I mentioned, this feels much smaller. It feels much more intimate, but nonetheless, the crowds are still really up for it, right?
That's right.
And at this point, he's kind of starting to get more, put more Jam songs in the set, more Style Council songs in the set. And I'm going to kind of run through a few of the tracks as well, because it must have been amazing. It must have been amazing to be playing some of these, which are proper classics. So How She Threw It All Away, Head Starts to Happen. What a tune. Speak Like a Child.
Yeah.
It's a very deep sea. Every time you chuck one of these new ones in, you must have been like going, oh, wow, yeah, this is great.
Definitely. And also, I've just found those rehearsals they put up. I don't know if they're in Paul's archive. The ones on YouTube.
Yeah.
The deep sea's there, isn't it?
Yeah.
When I listen back to those now, man, it was just like amazing, really.
That's such a good song, because that was also the one that they closed the Style Council documentary with tail end of last year as like a little surprise with the band back together. That tune just stacks up. It's such a great tune, isn't it?
Beautiful, isn't it? The
tour finishes with 2 nights at the Town and Country Club in London and live on the BBC. Now, was it live or pre-recorded live, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, live. It was like a gig and they just brought all their gear and recorded it.
Is that in the back of your mind when you're playing? Of like, oh crap, I'm on the radio?
Not really. Well, no, not really, because essentially it was the end of a tour. So, anything you were going to mess up, you would have already done. And you kind of knew where you were. You knew what your job was. The engine room was running nicely and you just walk on and you play. And there happens to be recording it. That was all it was, essentially, really. So did they record the second night, Dan? Which night did they record, do you know?
I'm not sure, because I know the full thing is on the third. There's like this, what was it, Weller at the BBC box set, wasn't there? And it's like,
yeah, that's right.
This is obviously it's a really short period, but the time spent on the road there with that band, you sound so tight. I mean, how does that come about? Because and you mentioned like the last night of the tour you'd expect to be, but that's hard work, isn't it, to get to sound that good?
Yeah, it is hard work. I mean, every musician works hard, but it's the group of players that are working together, that are working collectively. If you're thinking collectively and working collectively, you've got a talent, it's all going to sort of gel. And obviously, Steve and I had already toured together, so we had a connection with Galliano. We had a connection with Mick. And actually, no, I think I did a session with him. Didn't I have a thing called a guy called Pumpkin or something? Do you know this? An acid jazz sort of compilation album. And they asked Steve and Mick put a track together, so I went in the studio and did it with them. I'll send it to you.
Okay.
But 'cause obviously, even then, we'd already recorded with Steve. But the point I'm making is I'd already recorded with Steve and Mick, toured with Steve, and toured with Steve and Mick and Galliano. So when we got to Paul, it wasn't like we didn't know each other. We didn't understand how each other played together. So that really helped to get that band, I think, the rhythm section, sitting comfortably when we started to work with Paul, essentially. That's what I think it was.
And how directive is Paul in terms of saying what he wants and don't do that, do it this way, or actually is it kind of fairly loose and you're jamming together and having a great time? Or
I think so, but you know what? I think he gave us quite a load of leeway, really. And what I like about that is, he gives you a load of leeway and you're sort of playing away and all of a sudden he'll just stop it and say, no, don't do that. It's like, okay, fair. But it's not like every 10 seconds, no, don't do that. He kind of gives you a little bit of leeway. And then when it's not happening, he'll stand up and tell you no. And I really appreciate that, because then you're getting guidance, plus your input is appreciated as well, which I quite like.
At this point, so I mentioned John Weller. I have to also mention Kenny Wheeler. So Kenny's the tour manager. Kenny
was a sort of, I guess you call him road manager, tour manager. And every time, we did quite a few dates, obviously. So every time we got on the bus, he'd sort of count everybody, 1, 2, 3, which is okay the first week, but 3 weeks in, like you're knackered, you just want to get to your seat and sleep. And he says, no, wait a minute, I've got to count everybody. So I said, Ken, man, why do you have to count everybody? He goes, well, I think it was a Style Council tour. He said, I left somebody at the services. I said, who was that? He goes, Mick Talbot. Imagine driving off and Mick's back at the stage.
Yeah, exactly. And no disrespect. That band was Mick, Paul at the very beginning. It's like, oh my God, that's so funny. The Town and Country Club. So that last gig of you with the Paul Weller movement, you've listened back to that since, right?
Yeah. Well, I had it on cassette because I recorded is it Radio 2? I can't remember if it's Radio 1 or 2. Thing is, if you say Radio 2, it sounds like old people's music. So I'm going to say Radio 1, right? I had it on tape literally, I think, when they broadcast it or somebody recorded it. So I've had it on cassette since we'd done it. And so I've been listening to it. I finished the gig, I went home, I listened to it. And in the last 30 years, I've always stuck it on just to sort of to reflect and have a listen, And I was listening to it last night again. There you go.
It's a great sound. The set list, the songs, everybody looks so cool. Like the whole thing just was really lovely.
Do you think some of that is to do with the live sound, the BBC? The live sound guys at the TNC are amazing, but it might have been the way the BBC captured that performance as well. You've got to, give them some applause for that as well, I think, Dan. Do you think?
You can hear the sound of everybody. You're coming through as bass. You're hearing the trumpets. You're hearing, sometimes if the whole thing can sound a bit muddy and everybody's just kind of in the mix together, whereas actually the processing on that or whatever they've done in post to make that sound good for the radio is brilliant, I have to say. Yeah, but you can also feel the vibe of that gig and the kind of energy from the band playing off each other.
Yes, definitely. it is a bit tricky because it's Paul's gig and you can't be too, you've got to maintain some kind of decorum, but you can't be standing there stiff as a board. So you kind of, you've got to be careful how you deal with a gig like that. And I enjoyed it. I tried to maintain some kind of decorum while I was playing, if you know what I mean. So,
did you know that would be your last gig with the Paul Weller movement at that time?
I tell you that. And this is just how it went. I think that the musical direction changed, and I wasn't suitable for that new direction of music because I came out of the acid jazz soul thing, and I think he was going into a new area of music. And it sounds great. That I can see where he was going with that, and I think it's good. Really, I applaud him, for doing that, So,
and what do you think of the past 30 years? So when you kind of listen to, the new stuff that Paul puts out from, I say new, this is 30 years ago now, but from this first solo album to Wildwood, Stanley Road, and all the way through to On Sunset, are you still a fan? Are you still dipping in?
I think I am. And I tell you what, the good thing about not playing with Paul anymore is I can actually be a fan, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And listen. Other than, I've got to learn this tune, I've got to learn that tune. I can actually sit back and listen and watch him progress in his songwriting, which is, that's a blessing, really, I think, to be honest. Yeah. I'm not being encumbered with that worry about, what my part in that is just to have a listen to what's going on. It's great,
Yeah. Now, a couple of other things to touch on. So, Midge you played with, so Ultravox.
Midge was a pop star, basically, and he was in a band called Slick. And between Ultravox and Slick, he had this band called The Rich Kids. And the Rich Kids guitar player was a friend of mine, and that's how I got that connection with Midge. And we went over to his house to do some recording. He lived in Chiswick. Spent a couple of days with him there. which I don't know what happened to that recording.
And the other one that I was going to ask you about was Steve, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Steve Hillage.
Oh, yes.
And I'll be honest, I don't know anything about Steve, but one of the things I love about this podcast is that it's opening me up to new music and new experience as well. So talk to me about Steve and talk to me about that experience, because this sounds really interesting and exciting.
Okay, so Steve came from the prog rock, and he was involved in a band called Gong, who are still going now. And there were two gongs eventually. There was this kind of sort of really freaky prog rock gong and a sort of jazz fusion-y gong. There was Gong 1 and Gong 2, and Steve was involved in that. Right. But in his solo career, he used a couple of guys from... He made about 5 or 6 albums, of which I did one. But he also used the guys from Stevie Wonder's band for the record before us, called Green and Motivation Radio. So he was into the funk thing as well. And that's what attracted me to Steve. I mean, he approached me, but when I heard what he was doing, I thought, oh man, this is great. You know, when I heard the earlier albums and the funky sort of rhythm section from the earlier albums. Right. And that's what got me attracted to working with him, essentially, yeah. We did the album open and then we did the tour. Pretty much did the same gigs.
Same venues.
yeah. We did Hammersmith. Well, it's called the Bats. What's it called now? Apollo. What's
I don't know anymore. It's been so long since I've been to a gig. I can't remember.
That's where whenever you ended up in London, you used to do the Apollo, but Paul did a T&C. But usually, yeah. So the Apollo was the one you always ended up at. When I did the Apollo gig with Steve, I went up on the tube and because all the gear was there, and I went home and then got, chilled out and went back to the gig. And I was on the tube with all the people going to the gig. It was great. And then when I got to the gig, I was playing, I could see they were looking at me going, oh, wait, wasn't he on the tube?
So the other thing I wanted to talk to you about is teaching, because as well as the playing and the sessions and all that, you're also involved in teaching other people to play, which is lovely. And I used to live around Guildford area, and I'm a massive fan of the ACM, and I know you've done some work with them, which is the Academy of Contemporary Music. They're a fabulous crew down there. So talk to me about the teaching. How does that work, and how has it worked in a remote world as well, over Zoom and all that?
The music industry changed around sort of 80s to 90s with technology, and it kind of the world that we worked in got smaller and smaller and narrower because of technology. So a lot of pro musicians, and most of the guys I know, have gone into teaching to supplement their income. And round about sort of 92, 93, the Musicians Institute popped up in Wapping. And because I've done Paul and stuff like that, they were looking for established musicians to be part of the teaching, their group of teachers. So I started working in Wapping and then just stayed teaching for like 15 years, essentially. I went from the Musicians Institute to the ACM, then to BIM in Brighton, and then Solent University because I moved out of town. Obviously, none of those places are operating, so it's all remote now. But the thing is, I can actually watch what they're doing and I can see on the screen whether they're, making errors with their technique and stuff. So it hasn't changed that much, but it's not as easy as it sounds, actually, because the communication of sending data both ways hasn't really been sorted out with any of these video conferencing apps. You can't stream 5 people playing live in separate areas because it's not possible with technology at the moment. So they need to sort it out, and everyone's having the same problem.
Now, before we go, a couple of final questions for you. You have to tell me about Funky Alchemy, Capricorn 1, because there are Weller links to this as well with Mickey Talbot from the Style Council. And also, I think, and I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, but Gerard Presenza.
Was he with Paul?
I'm sure he played trumpet with Paul, and maybe the Style Council. I'm going to get slaughtered on the socials for not knowing exactly this, but I'm sure he played with. Anyway, tell me what it is.
Okay, right. So basically, it's the same old lot. You're going to get bored. Same old names keep appearing. So it's myself and Harbans and Mick. And we went to a studio in Greenwich called Wood Wharf, and we knocked out some grooves. And we spent 3 days it was just to get together to play. There was no plans for it. And we got together and we almost come out after 3 days with an album's worth of material. So we thought, yeah, man, let's go in the studio and record it. So we went to Alchemia Studios in South West London, which I don't believe is there anymore. And we set the rhythm section down, put the parts down, and we just called people in to play, to overdub horns and guitar and congas. And then that set of tracks became available. So we self-funded that album.
Back to the funk and jazz stuff, but rock. And there's this track it kind of opens with. India's Groove is the first track with Harbans on drums. And man alive, it's just great the way that comes in, and then you're along for the ride. So these are all instrumentals, right?
They are all instrumental songs, yeah. I don't know why that is. I do like singers. I haven't got anything against singers, Dan.
Is it because none of you could sing?
Exactly. That's it. That's totally it. Yeah.
Mickey Talbot sang a few with the Style Council.
He did, didn't he? We should have got it. Oh.
Yeah. Oh, well. And what are you doing with it now then? Because there's this Bandcamp thing, right?
Well, what it was, I got my PRS statement through last year, and I realised they were using a couple of tracks on TV. Or the BBC were using one of the tracks. And I only discovered that in my PRS statement. So I thought, I could maybe start promoting it. Now it's out there. And I had a band called Capricorn One, and I was playing the tune in that band anyway. We kind of rearranged it and stuff. And so I got the tracks back together again, and I remastered them and I released them. And they're on Bandcamp right now. Well,
I shall put the links in the show notes for the podcast. This has been an absolute joy. I have 2 final questions for you, Paul. You are allowed one Paul Weller song for the rest of your life. It can be The Jam, The Style Council, or Weller solo. Which one are you going to go with?
I think it's going to be Very Deep Sea, personally. I love it.
The Style Council version or the version you played with the Movement?
I'm going to say Style Council version because that's without that version, I wouldn't have been able to play what I did. So definitely Style Council version. Yeah.
And then the final question is, the reason for this podcast to exist is so that I can get an interview with Paul Weller, the one that I missed throughout my entire radio broadcast career. If I do secure that interview, he's laughing. If I do get that interview, what should I talk about, Paul? Is there a burning question you'd love the man to answer?
Yeah, why did you fire me, Paul? Why did you fire me?
Awkward.
No, to be honest, you know what I'd like to ask him, because I don't know if this is going to go on a podcast, but he was having a few personal problems at the time, and I'd like to know that he's happy now. My question will be to him, are you happy now, Paul?
Paul, this has been an absolute joy. Thank you so much for your time. I've loved every second of this. I really appreciate it, man.
Great, man. I really appreciate you reaching out to me. It's been great. I've enjoyed it.
My thanks once again to Paul Francis. So lovely to hear all about the start of Paul's solo career from another angle. If you've enjoyed this episode and the series so far, then please give it a plug on your social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Check out the show notes for more information, including details about Capricorn One and that Paul Weller live at the BBC gig we were talking about. And while you're there, you can even buy me a virtual coffee. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.